My name is Meyer, and I'm the National Co-Chair of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the oldest interfaith peace and justice organization in U.S. history. And I'm here in Venezuela as a human rights activist, as a peace and justice organizer, to learn what I could behind the headlines that we see in the U.S. about this country in South America. In the U.S., we read that Venezuela is on the verge of civil war, that Venezuelans face tremendous food shortages and an economic crisis almost unimaginable. And yet, in my time here in the capital in Caracas, in my time in 3 small towns and villages in the interior of the country, and in all my time going in between one to another to the third, I saw nothing that looks like any of those headlines suggest. In fact, when I think about civil war, I think about Charlottesville. I think about the church in Texas, the Baptist church, that was just the site of the latest of incredible hate crimes and attacks. And I think about U.S. society that's deeply divided and that's deeply on the brink of what feels like extraordinary violence, none of which I have felt for a moment here in Venezuela. It does not mean that everything is perfect here, and certainly I have not been here long enough to be able to tell some of the intricacies or nuances of questions of peace and justice here in this country. And yet, there's no question that one does not walk down the streets of Caracas, one does not walk in the small towns and villages in the country and hear or feel a great sense of violence. One does not feel a sense of collapse. One does not feel a sense of economic crisis. It's not like every meal is filled with huge amounts of food, but it is like everyone is sharing what they have. And the conversations that one has, the conversations I've had this week with plain people on the street, not looked on by any governmental overseers or local officials, are conversations about how to make a better society. They're about how to make a better planet, because people are concerned about the climate and climate change. They're about basic issues of food and justice, and about how all of us can share better. They're not fundamentally about a system or a country in crisis. And so in many ways, thinking about going back to the US as I will do, and thinking about the many places I visited as a human rights activist around the world over the last decades, I think about this moment in my own country's history and the US headlines that I read every day. And it really feels like we are in as Orwellian a moment as we ever have been. When we see war, we have to think peace, because civil war is not the case of Venezuela. When we see economic crisis, we have to think alternatives being discussed. Because in a way, what Venezuelans are doing, what they're talking about, what I'm hearing in this time here, is a story about trying to make a better world. And if those of us who work for peace and human rights in the US and around the world are to understand this moment, this strange Orwellian moment when one can't quite trust one's headlines, but one can play with one's animals, and one can embrace one's family, one can laugh with friends, but more importantly, what one can and what one must do is one must look at countries like Venezuela, one must look at Venezuela, and one must say, how can we understand behind the headlines what it is that makes this conversation happening in this country so challenging to the rulers back in Washington, D.C.? And what must we do as U.S. citizens and global human rights activists to challenge those in D.C. to look at things another way, and to take their boots off the back of the people of Venezuela working for a better tomorrow?